Hello, my name is Ryu, and this is my review. It's pretty rare that I don't enjoy a game. I can usually find a number of things to like about the overall experience, even if it is heavily flawed, and come away having enjoyed myself. Unfortunately, the game for today's review was so painful to play that the few redeeming qualities did not come even close to helping its case. Toren is a puzzle adventure game with a really interesting intended use that is let down by, well, almost everything else. Toren was developed by the Brazilian developer Swordtails. It was partially funded by the Brazilian government through a public tax credit referred to as Rouanet law. I probably pronounced that wrong. This law is designed to help fund creative projects that explore Brazilian culture. This is honestly extremely cool. At its core, Toren is an educational game. Everything in the game is symbolic of Brazilian folklore. I'm a teacher by trade, and I feel that video games have the potential to be a very effective educational medium. Unfortunately, Toren falls very short of its potential on all fronts. Let's get into why. Toren plays like a clunky Zelda game. In fact, you might even consider Toren to be a single, albeit fairly large, Zelda dungeon. The game has a few puzzle mechanics that sort of build off of each other, but not enough that I would consider it satisfactory. There's technically combat, but it really functions more as another puzzle mechanic than anything else. Each puzzle is fairly simple, and is usually only made difficult by either poor environment design or terrible controls. For example, near the beginning of the game, there are 3 boards that need to be moved to progress forward. To the game's credit, these boards are clearly outlined when you come near them. I wasn't able to move them at first, however. Once again, to its credit, the game clearly communicated that I had missed something. It took me quite a while to figure out that I needed to crawl through this little hole, though. Not because I wasn't looking for it. I knew I needed to get to the other side of the wall. But because there's so much other stuff cluttering the environment that I didn't even notice the opening until my 3rd or 4th time searching. The issue is repeated throughout the game. Minor details that are difficult to notice prevent progression. The game's collectibles are also hidden like this, but I don't mind that and actually praise it. These are not necessary for finishing the game, but are a neat discovery when you do find them. The fact that they are so well hidden actually makes searching for minute details in the environment quite fun. Platforming comes into play during the dream sequences. Throughout the game, the player character, Moonchild, will enter dreams that contain some frustrating platforming and light puzzle solving. The dreams ramp up in complexity and difficulty of platforming. One example of particularly frustrating platforming happens near the end of the game. The player must use the look control to navigate a series of bridges while looking only at a ceiling mirror. I thought this was pretty cool when I encountered it, but quickly realized how poorly this part of the game interacted with mouse and keyboard controls. I should note that the Steam page does recommend a controller for Toren. The game only has 8 directions in which you can move. This caused major issues when I was forced to inch my way across the bridges in a zigzag motion. The fact that all controls were inverted made this section extra frustrating. Another dream sequence introduced a very interesting mechanic that ended up going nowhere. A recurring theme throughout the game is resurrection. When Moonchild dies, she is resurrected, and usually even comes back younger, and is able to continue climbing the tower with knowledge from her past self. That's pretty cool. Even cooler is the fact that the dragon's breath petrifies Moonchild and turns her to stone. These become permanent fixtures in the game world. Again, very cool. This dream sequence has the player moving along a ledge that the dragon is watching over. The only way to avoid the breath is to stand behind a pillar or one of the petrified Moonchilds. To get through this section, you need to die enough times to create enough statues to safely traverse the ledge between dragon breaths. This is a really cool idea for a mechanic that is never used again. I would much prefer it if the game had further explored and expanded on this mechanic than have what we'll be talking about next. The combat. Toren barely has combat. First of all, there are very few enemies. Only the dragon and these tiny little minions are able to be fought. The floating Dementor things can't be damaged. Really though, only the dragon is fought in combat. You can kill the little enemies, but it's much easier just to avoid them. When you do fight them, they either die instantly or just go right through the sword. It's pretty buggy. There are only 2 instances in the game that could be considered a battle. The first is shortly after you obtain the sword. You run up to the dragon, swing at it a few times, and it knocks the sword out of your hand. You have to run and pick up the sword before his breath petrifies you, which is usually impossible. If you get hit by the breath, you run back and continue to hit the dragon. Damage on the dragon carries over from life to life, so it's only a matter of time until you beat it. There are pillars you run behind that protect you from the breath. The sword also protects you from the breath, but again, it was nearly impossible to retrieve the sword before the breath that came after the knockback. It was very frustrating. The second battle is the final climax. Obviously, this means I'm about to spoil the final encounter, so skip ahead to the next section if you feel so compelled. Moonchild is now fighting alongside a knight of some sort. This fight follows a similar pattern to the last with 2 new mechanics. First of all, the dragon now flaps its wings and will blow you off the platform. To prevent this, you need to hold on to either the knight or the pillars that are strewn about. Second, the knight is susceptible to the dragon's breath. You need to stand in front of the knight with the sword to protect him. Luckily, the dragon no longer knocks the sword out of your hand. That's really all there is to it. There are a few other platforming and puzzle sections, but they are hardly notable. Toren is very light gameplay-wise. I would almost go so far as to call it a walking simulator. It's also a very easy game. The few times the game became difficult was not due to complexity of gameplay or requiring of player skill, but because of poor controls and bugs. I don't like being harsh, but this game is just not fun to play. This game does not look good. The graphical fidelity is very low, textures are gnarly, and the character models are fairly low quality. All 3 would be more appropriate on an early PS2 game, certainly not the PS4 and PC. Despite this fact, the game runs very poorly even on my relatively high-end machine. Specs are listed on screen and in my channel description. Low graphical fidelity does not necessarily mean a game looks bad. Some of my favorite games are those that use an aesthetic that works with low graphical fidelity, such as Wind Waker and old school RuneScape. The animations are also poorly implemented. Even the cutscenes don't work correctly most of the time. For example, watch this cutscene of a Moonchild climbing on a statue. Her feet aren't even close to making contact with the statue that breaks beneath her. It's weird and just sloppy. Toren's aesthetic clashes with itself. The environments can sometimes look great, while others look awful. The dream sequences have well-developed environments, while the open world is often bland and just looks bad. The character models range from decent to deep in the Uncanny Valley. For those who don't know, the Uncanny Valley is the phenomenon which is unsettling or eerie due to human-like features. Fully grown Moonchild and the Mage have decent character model designs. The younger Moonchild character models are pretty low quality and often just look wrong. The main antagonist, a black dragon, looks very out of place. Something about the model just doesn't fit with the rest of the world. Part of me thinks that the inconsistent aesthetic was a purposeful decision by the developers. Toren seems to be based on an art style shown when looking through a telescope early in the game, The animation is very granular and has many clashing textures. Given how much of this game is meant to be symbolic and mystical, I wouldn't be surprised if this was the case. Unfortunately, while it would have been clever, it wouldn't have made up for the fact that the game just looks bad. The poor aesthetic is particularly problematic because the promotional material for this game, particularly the screenshots, does not accurately portray the quality of the game's visuals. I played the game at max settings. There were very few graphical options anyway, and the game looks nowhere near as good as the screenshots suggest. Even the trailer on the Steam page looks a lot cleaner than the actual game. The primary YouTube trailer portrays the game's visuals and even frame rate much more reliably. Link in the description. One positive aspect of the overall aesthetic is the music. It is quite well composed and beautiful to listen to. It's also well implemented into gameplay. Toren's soundtrack was produced by Novastrike Soundscape with composer Vinicius Kleinsorgen. I likely did not pronounce that correctly. Toren's story is its most interesting part and is quite simple, but because of how it is told, the specifics are somewhat incomprehensible. I know that was a really confusing statement, but stick with me. In his video, The Witness, A Great Game That You Shouldn't Play, Joseph Anderson notes the 4 types of stories. Simple story simply told, simple story complexly told, complex story simply told, and complex story complexly told. I really recommend his channel, by the way. He provides some of the best analytical content around. Toren sits firmly in the simple story complexly told category. The story is told primarily through its imagery and is contextualized with proverbs that are strewn throughout the game world. Obvious spoilers are ahead. In the most literal sense, the story involves the mage preparing Moonchild to climb the tower and defeat the dragon. As Moonchild moves forward, she ages and learns, and sometimes reverts to her younger self. Whenever Moonchild dies, she is reborn and continues her journey. It is implied that hundreds of Moonchilds have died and been reborn. Moonchild also seems to be chasing after a warrior who she sees through a telescope early in the game. When she finally accomplishes her goal, she walks into the sun, creates an eclipse, and then night falls. That's right. Moonchild's objective is to stop the eternal daylight and return night to the land. I should note that I only figured this out at the very end when I saw the final scene. I later watched the Steam trailer, which specifically notes this. Again, everything in Toren is symbolic. That's pretty cool on its own. The developers put in a huge amount of work and really delved into Brazilian folklore to design Toren's world and story. However, a natural consequence is that the game is so complex in its symbolism and lore that it becomes near incomprehensible. The Steam page description states that Toren is poetry brought to life. If this is the case, then it's a pretty redundant game because it displays that poetry as you discover dream sequences and progress through the game. I'm pretty sure they're meant to be connected and analyzed as a whole, but they're so spread out that it would be difficult to consider them as a whole without writing them all down. Frankly, I don't think it's worth it. Even if someone did that, and I haven't found anyone that has, I'm not sure there would be much of a point. Again, Toren's story is simple. It's a coming-of-age story rooted in complex symbolism along the story of restoring the night. The proverbs mostly have to do with either taking wisdom from others or with learning to do what is right as one grows up. Had the story been better executed, it could have been really engaging. In my opinion, the proverbs are mostly unnecessary and only create needless complexity. Instead of appearing deep and thoughtful, Toren comes across as very pretentious. Using a more standard storytelling structure or even telling the story solely through its imagery would have been more concise and effective. Again, I usually like the games I play. I actually have a pretty high tolerance for disengaging gameplay as long as it's a smooth experience and I enjoy the world I'm exploring. What I tend not to care for is a lack of polish. Bugs, poor performance, and unfinished gameplay completely turned me off to a game. Unfortunately, Toren has very disengaging gameplay and is very unpolished, and it does little to make up for its glaring issues. I really like that the developers tried to make an educational game meant to really engage the player with symbolic mysticism, but in order for that to work, the game has to be well put together. After all, why would an author write a deep and thoughtful poem only to leave in a bunch of typos? Sorry for such a negative video, but thanks for taking the time to watch this. I hope it was interesting and/or informative. I will see you next time.